My name is Tara, and at 32 years old, I never expected to be hunted by my own blood. My parents drugged me and left me to die in a remote wilderness so my sister could steal my son. When I finally found a phone and called for help, my mother just laughed. She said they already told him I died and warned me not to make them liars, so I made them regret it. Before I tell you how a freezing night in the mountains turned into the ultimate revenge, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to fight back against the people who were supposed to love you. Ice is a remarkable thing. It burns before it numbs. I woke up with my cheek pressed against a jagged rock covered in frost. My body was convulsing in violent shudders. I tried to open my eyes, but my eyelashes were frozen together. When I finally pried them apart, the world was a blinding expanse of white and gray. Snow was falling heavily, coating my bare arms. I pushed myself up onto my hands and knees, immediately gagging. Acid and bile burned my throat as I retched into the snow. Mixed with the bitter taste of stomach acid was the distinct floral flavor of chamomile tea and something else, something metallic and thick. Panic set in as I looked down at myself. I was wearing only a thin silk blouse and dress slacks, no winter coat, no gloves, no boots. Just my bare feet stuffed into thin dress socks resting on freezing Appalachian terrain. I patted my pockets frantically. My phone was gone. My wallet was gone. The keys to my apartment were gone. The biting wind whipped through the trees, slicing right through my thin clothing. Hypothermia was not a distant threat. It was a countdown clock already ticking in my bloodstream. I forced myself to stand leaning heavily against the trunk of a massive oak tree. My head throbbed with a sickening rhythm, the lingering effects of whatever high-grade sedative had been slipped into my drink. As I took my first agonizing step, the memory of last night hit me with the force of a physical blow. We were in the formal dining room of my parents' sprawling estate, the crystal chandeliers casting a warm glow over the mahogany table. I had brought my 6-year-old son Dion for Sunday dinner, a rare occurrence since I usually avoided family gatherings, but my mother Gloria had insisted. She said it was crucial for family unity. I should have known better. Unity in my family only meant falling in line with their perfectly curated image. As I stumbled through the snow, using the moss on the north side of the trees to orient myself, the hallucinated voices of my family began to echo in my ears. The drug in my system was making the memories bleed into reality. I could see my sister Chantel sitting across the table inspecting her flawless manicure. Chantel was the golden child, the vain woman who married Preston, a wealthy white politician currently running for the state senate. I remembered the smell of the roasted lamb and the clinking of silver forks. Then I remembered Preston leaning forward, his blue eyes cold and calculating. He was talking about his poll numbers. He needed to secure the minority vote, but his background was too privileged, too disconnected. I remembered how he looked at my son Dion, who was playing quietly in the corner. A black single mother does not fit the demographic we are courting, Tara. Preston had said, his voice dripping with condescension. You are a distraction. But Chantel and I stepping up to adopt Dion, a young black boy whose mother is unfit. That shows charity. That shows family values. It bridges the gap perfectly. I stumbled over a hidden root and fell hard into a snowbank, scraping my palms. The physical pain snapped me back to the freezing woods, but the memory kept playing. I remembered grabbing Dion's hand and telling them they were out of their minds. I remembered walking toward the door, and then my mother Gloria blocking my path. She had handed me a cup of her special chamomile tea. Her eyes were hard, lacking any trace of maternal warmth. Drink it, Tara, she had commanded. Preston needs a wholesome family photo for the campaign. Chantel cannot have children, and you know that. You know her surgeries went wrong. But she is married to a future senator. She deserves Dion more than you. You have always been a stubborn embarrassment. Drink the tea and calm down before you ruin this for us. I remembered looking at my father Calvin, waiting for him to intervene. He just stared at his wine glass, completely silent. His massive gambling debts were no secret in our circles. He needed Preston's political money to avoid ruin. He was willing to trade his own daughter and grandson to keep his country club membership and his pristine reputation. I forced myself back to my feet, gritting my teeth as the frozen ground tore at the soles of my feet. I am an ecotourism developer. I buy neglected wilderness tracts and turn them into sustainable reserves. I know the woods. I know how to survive. I assessed the terrain. The incline of the land suggested I was near a valley. I needed to find a ridge or a structure. I kept moving, rubbing my arms vigorously to generate friction. Every step was agony, but the image of Dion's terrified face pushed me forward. I had to get back to my son. They were not going to turn him into a political prop. Hours seemed to pass. The snow deepened. My lips were cracked and bleeding. The hallucinated voice of my mother kept taunting me through the wind. "You were always so difficult, Tara, always challenging the status quo. Why could you not just be a good girl like Chantel?" I screamed into the empty woods, pushing through a thick thicket of pine branches. As I broke through the clearing, I saw it. A heavy wooden cabin sitting on a raised concrete foundation. An old emergency ranger station. It was battered and weathered, but it was shelter. I dragged my frozen, battered body up the wooden stairs. The front door was secured with a heavy padlock. I did not have the strength to break a window, nor did I want to let the freezing wind inside. I noticed a loose floorboard on the porch. I kicked at it with my heel, ignoring the pain as my skin bruised. The board cracked, revealing a rusted crowbar underneath. I wedged the tool into the padlock mechanism and threw my entire body weight against it. The lock snapped with a loud crack. I stumbled inside, slamming the door shut behind me to block out the howling wind. The station was dark and smelled of dust and old wood. I fumbled along the wall until my numb fingers found a light switch. I flipped it. Nothing happened. The power was out. But as my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I saw a bulky red box mounted on the far wall, an emergency landline, the kind wired directly into underground municipal lines independent of the main power grid. I practically crawled across the room. My fingers were stiff and unresponsive, but I managed to lift the heavy handset. I pressed it to my ear. A steady dial tone greeted me. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I dialed my parents' home number. The numbers were seared into my brain. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. I prayed someone would answer. I prayed my father might have a shred of conscience left. The line clicked open. "Hello." It was Gloria. Her voice was perfectly calm, smooth, and elegant, the voice she used when hosting charity galas. "Mom," I gasped, my voice a ragged, shaking whisper. "Mom, please. I am in the woods. It is freezing. Please, I need help." The silence on the other end was absolute. There was no gasp of shock, no maternal panic, just a cold, calculating pause. "Tara," Gloria said. Her tone was completely flat. "How are you awake? That tea was supposed to stop your heart." The sheer malice in her words paralyzed me. I stood in the freezing cabin, dripping with melted snow, realizing that my own mother had not just wanted me out of the way. She had wanted me dead. "Mom, I have nothing." I cried, the desperation clawing at my throat. "Please, Dion needs me. Tell me where you dropped me. Call an ambulance." A sharp, cruel laugh echoed through the receiver. It was a sound entirely devoid of humanity. "Do not call here again, Tara," Gloria said, her voice dripping with venom. "We already told little Dayon that you slipped off a cliff during a hiking trip. Chantel is buying him a black suit for your memorial service as we speak. Do not make us liars. Just die quietly." The line went dead. I stood there holding the silent receiver. The shivering in my body suddenly stopped. The tears that had been welling in my eyes froze on my cheeks. The desperate, terrified daughter who had begged for her mother's help evaporated into the cold air. In her place, something entirely different was born, something forged in ice and absolute betrayal. I slowly placed the receiver back onto the hook. The panic was gone. My mind became razor-sharp, processing everything with terrifying clarity. They wanted to play God. They wanted to steal my son for a political campaign and erase my existence to cover their tracks. I turned away from the phone and looked around the dusty ranger station. The moonlight filtering through the dirty windows caught the glint of a metal plaque bolted to the side of the emergency phone box. I walked closer, squinting to read the engraved letters. Property of Apex Holdings, Blackwood Reserve, Sector 4. I stared at the plaque. A slow, dark smile spread across my bleeding lips. Apex Holdings, my blind LLC. The corporate entity I used to purchase massive tracts of wilderness without my family knowing about my immense wealth. My parents and Preston had driven me hours out of the city. They had searched for the most remote, dangerous, unforgiving patch of Appalachian wilderness they could find to dump my body. They thought they were leaving me in a lawless void where no one would ever look. I wiped a streak of blood from my face and walked over to the main electrical panel by the door. I popped open the metal cover to reveal a digital keypad. My fingers, though bruised and freezing, moved with absolute certainty. I typed in the master override code. LEO. A green light flashed on the panel. The backup generators hummed to life deep beneath the floorboards. Overhead lights flickered on, illuminating the cabin. The heating vents hissed as warm air began to pump into the room. A bank of surveillance monitors on the back wall flared to life, showing dozens of high-definition camera feeds covering every inch of the forest outside. I looked at the cameras, seeing the very spot where they had dumped me in the snow. The infrared sensors had captured everything. "You dumped me in the Blackwood Reserve," I whispered to the empty room, feeling the warmth begin to seep back into my bones. "You stupid, arrogant fools. I own this mountain." I pressed the heavy red button beneath the camera monitors. I did not need to speak a word. The signal pinged directly to a private server in the city. I slumped against the wall, the forced heat from the vents stinging my frostbitten skin. Every nerve ending screamed as my blood began to thaw, but the physical agony was nothing compared to the ice forming around my heart. Within 40 minutes, headlights cut through the heavy snowfall outside the cabin. A matte black SUV carved its way up the restricted access road, stopping inches from the porch. The heavy door slammed, and heavy boots pounded up the wooden steps. Vance stepped into the light. He wore a dark wool overcoat, his face an unreadable mask of calm intensity. As my business partner and lead corporate attorney, Vance knew everything about the empire I had built under the radar. He took one look at my bare, bruised feet, the torn silk of my blouse, and the drying blood on my face. He did not ask questions. He walked to the storage locker, pulled out a military-grade thermal blanket, and wrapped it tightly around my shivering shoulders. He looked up at the monitors. The frozen frames still showed my mother and father dragging me toward the ravine. Vance reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. I knew he was dialing the state police commissioner. We had politicians in our pocket, too. I reached out and pushed his hand down. "No police," I rasped, my throat raw. "If we call them now, my parents will spin it. They have spent years telling their country club friends and the church congregation that I am mentally unstable. They will say I wandered off in a manic episode. They will say I imagined the tea. They will wrap themselves in a blanket of parental concern, and the police will hand my son right back to them. We do this my way." Vance looked at me, his dark eyes studying the absolute resolve in mine. He put the phone back in his pocket, nodded once, and helped me toward the door. "We are making you a ghost," he said quietly. The drive down the mountain was a blur of painkillers and exhaust heat. Vance took me to his secure private residence in the city, a place totally off the grid and unconnected to my known addresses. While a private concierge doctor treated my frostbite and pumped me full of fluids, Vance went to work. He sat behind a massive curved desk, his fingers flying across dual keyboards. By dawn, I was sitting in an oversized armchair, wrapped in a thick sweater, holding a mug of hot tea that I could barely swallow without tasting the poison from the night before. I watched the massive screen mounted on Vance's wall. He had bypassed the security firewalls of Preston and Chantel's estate. It was frighteningly easy when you had the kind of capital we did. I have their internal network, Vance murmured, pulling up a grid of 9 camera feeds. Smart home cameras, security feeds, even the audio from their digital assistants. My eyes locked onto a feed from a room I did not recognize. It was painted a sterile, cold gray. In the center of the room stood my 6-year-old son. Dion was crying, his small chest heaving as he tugged uncomfortably at the collar of a stiff, expensive black suit. My hands gripped the arms of my chair so hard my bruised knuckles turned white. Chantel marched into the frame. My sister looked impeccable, her hair blown out to perfection, wearing a tailored morning dress that probably cost more than my first car. She did not look like a woman who had just lost her sister. She looked like a woman preparing for a magazine cover shoot. She grabbed Dion by the shoulders, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his small arms. "Stand still," she snapped, her voice carrying crystal clear over the hacked audio feed. "I want my mommy," Dion sobbed, wiping his nose with the back of his expensive sleeve. "She promised we would go home today." Chantel yanked his arm down her face, contorting into an ugly sneer. "Stop crying for her. I am sick of hearing it. Your mother was a crazy, unstable woman who abandoned you. She left you because she did not want you. Preston and I are your parents now. You will call me Mom when we walk out that door, or you will not get any dinner. Do you understand me?" Dayon flinched, terrified by her venom. He nodded slowly, tears spilling silently down his cheeks. I stopped breathing. The air simply left my lungs. Watching my sister mentally abuse my child, hearing her plant those toxic lies in his innocent mind, it shattered the last remaining fraction of sisterly love I held on to. I remembered all the family dinners where Calvin and Gloria would casually mention my stress levels. I remembered them telling the pastor that I was struggling with delusions. They had been laying the groundwork for this exact moment for years. They had been isolating me, making me look like the erratic, unreliable scapegoat, all to ensure that when I finally disappeared, no one would question it. They wanted Chantel to have the perfect family she could never biologically produce, and they were perfectly fine sacrificing me to give it to her. Vance tapped a key, pulling up another feed. This one was from Preston's home office. Preston was pacing the length of his expensive Persian rug. He was holding a glass of amber liquid, laughing into a headset. Beside him stood his campaign manager, a slick man with a clipboard who was nodding enthusiastically. "I am telling you, it is a gold mine," Preston said, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "The tragic death of my sister-in-law right before the primary. It is a terrible loss, of course, but the optics are incredible. The voters will love that Chantel and I are stepping up to adopt a young black boy. It secures the minority vote perfectly. It softens my image from the ruthless corporate guy to the compassionate family man." His campaign manager chuckled. "We are drafting the press release now. We will emphasize how you are rescuing him from an unstable environment. We will paint Tara as a tragic figure, a victim of her own mental health. It makes you look like a savior." Preston took a sip of his drink, staring out the window with a look of pure, unadulterated greed. "Just make sure the paperwork is airtight. I cannot have any distant relatives popping up and contesting the custody. I need that boy officially carrying my last name before the debate on the 25th. I stared at the screen, my blood turning to ice. Preston did not see Dion as a nephew. He did not see him as a child grieving his mother. He saw my son as a political prop, a shiny new accessory to secure a seat in the state senate. My family was entirely complicit. They were selling my child to a white politician who viewed us as nothing more than stepping stones for his ambition. Vance remained silent, but I could hear the hard, rhythmic tapping of his keyboard. He pulled up a split screen next to the video feed. Lines of legal text scrolled past. "What is that?" I asked, my voice deadly quiet. Vance highlighted a section of the document. "The county clerk's office. A filing went through their emergency portal 2 hours ago. It is an expedited adoption petition." "How can they expedite it?" I asked, leaning forward. "The state requires a thorough investigation, a waiting period. They cannot just take him overnight. They can if the biological mother is documented as severely incapacitated or a danger to the child prior to her disappearance." Vance explained, his tone completely flat. He pulled up an attachment, I stared at the bright white screen. It was a psychiatric hold document dated 6 months ago. It detailed severe schizophrenic episodes, violent tendencies, and a formal recommendation for institutionalization. At the bottom of the page was my signature. "That is a forgery," I stated. Vance zoomed in on the signature. "A very good one. Your father's handiwork, most likely. He still works at that wealth management firm, right? He has access to your old trust documents. He traced it. They filed this to bypass the standard adoption waiting period. With you presumed dead, and this document on record, the judge will grant Preston emergency temporary custody by tomorrow morning." They had thought of everything. The poison tea, the remote wilderness, dropped the fake psychiatric history, the forged signature. They truly believed they had committed the perfect crime. They believed the scapegoat was finally silenced, erased from the world, leaving behind all her assets and her child for them to harvest. I looked at the baby monitor feed again. Dion was sitting on the edge of the massive, unfamiliar bed, hugging his knees to his chest. He looked so small, so utterly alone in that sterile mansion. I felt a tear slide down my cheek, but I did not wipe it away. The sadness was gone. What remained was a dark, consuming fire. I had spent my entire life trying to earn the love of a family that viewed my independence as a threat and my existence as an inconvenience. I had played the good daughter, turning the other cheek when they mocked my career in ecotourism, smiling politely when my father called my business a garbage collection service. They had no idea that my garbage collection service generated more revenue in a month than Preston's entire political fund. Tara Vance said softly, waiting for my command. I stood up from the armchair. The frostbite on my feet throbbed, but I ignored the pain. I walked closer to the monitors, staring directly at my father's forged signature on the screen. My parents thought they held all the power because they held the social status. They thought their country club memberships and their church standing made them untouchable. They had forgotten that real power does not make a sound until it strikes. "They want to play legal games," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "Let us play." Vance pulled up a new terminal window. "Calvin thinks he is a financial genius." I continued, my eyes tracking the live feed of Preston's house. "But I happen to know he has been bleeding money for years to keep up with my mother's spending habits. He took out secret loans against his pension. He has gambling debts he hid from Preston." Vance's fingers flew across the keys. "Finding it. Buy his debt," I ordered. "All of it. Every hidden marker, every underwater mortgage, every line of credit he opened to buy those expensive suits and country club fees. Route it through our most aggressive shell company," Don Vance said. "And Vance," I added, turning to look at my partner. "Freeze his accounts. Put a hard lock on every single asset he claims to own. I want him to try to buy a cup of coffee tomorrow and find out he is entirely legally bankrupt. Let us see how long my mother's elegant facade lasts when the money dries up." I looked back at the screen, watching Chantel forcefully drag my crying son out of the bedroom for his fitting. "Enjoy your new life, Chantel," I whispered to the glass screen. "Because the ghost of Blackwood Reserve is coming for everything you love." My father, Calvin, always believed that respect was something you could buy as long as you used the right credit card and wore the right custom-tailored suit. He spent his entire life curating an image of unshakable wealth and prestige within our city's elite circles. His absolute favorite stage for this performance was the Oakwood Country Club. Oakwood was a historically Black, highly exclusive establishment where the city's most influential doctors, lawyers, and political figures gathered to smoke imported cigars and compare their investment portfolios. For Calvin, being a premier member at Oakwood was not just a hobby. It was his entire identity. He needed those men to look at him with envy. He needed to be the patriarch of a rising political dynasty. He needed everyone to believe he was a kingmaker. Vance and I sat in the dim light of the secure bunker, listening to the live audio feed pouring through the speakers. Vance had bypassed the security protocols on my father's smartphone hours ago, giving us full access to the device's microphone. Through the crisp audio, I could hear the familiar ambient sounds of the Oakwood dining room, the soft clinking of heavy crystal glasses, the low hum of expensive jazz playing in the background. the murmurs of powerful men making deals over plates of seared scallops and caviar. And cutting through it all was my father's booming, arrogant voice. He was holding court at his usual center table, surrounded by men whose approval he desperately craved. "I am telling you, gentlemen, my son-in-law Preston is going to sweep this upcoming election." Calvin bragged, his voice dripping with unbearable smugness. "The voters are absolutely eating up his new platform. He is a man of the people, and with my daughter Chantel by his side, they are the picture of modern progress. They are bridging the gap. They are showing what true unity looks like in this state." I heard a man with a deep, gravelly voice respond. It was Judge Rawlings, one of Oakwood's oldest and most respected members. "It is certainly a strategic move, Calvin, adapting a young boy who just lost his mother. It plays very well with the demographics Preston needs to win. A terrible tragedy about your older daughter, by the way. My condolences." There was a brief pause on the audio feed. I waited, holding my breath to hear how my father would speak of my supposed death to his wealthy peers. Calvin let out a heavy, practiced sigh that sounded entirely devoid of actual grief. "Thank you, Judge. It has been a devastating week for our family. Tara was always a troubled soul. We tried to get her the psychiatric help she needed, but she simply refused our support. It is a heavy burden for a father to bear, but we take comfort in knowing little Dion is finally in a stable, wealthy home. Preston and Chantel will give him the life Tara never could." My nails dug so hard into the armrest of my chair that the leather creaked under the pressure. He was using my fabricated death and my ruined reputation to garner sympathy points while simultaneously elevating Preston and Chantel. He was selling my memory for social currency without a second thought. Vance looked over at me from behind his glowing monitors. His face was completely neutral, but his dark eyes held a dangerous glint. "Are we ready to proceed?" he asked softly, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Bring him down," I replied, my voice cold and steady. "Take away his crown." Over the audio feed I heard Calvin snap his fingers, calling out to a passing waiter. "Garçon, bring us 2 bottles of the Dom Perignon Vintage, the 2008. Put it all on my tab. We are celebrating the future senator tonight, gentlemen." I heard the polite, appreciative chuckles from the men at his table. Calvin was in his element, playing the benevolent billionaire, buying their loyalty with overpriced champagne. I could picture him perfectly leaning back in his leather chair, tossing his exclusive black card onto the silver tray without even looking at the waiter. Vance typed a rapid sequence of commands into his terminal. Lines of code cascaded down the screen as he accessed the financial routing networks. Calvin had hidden his massive gambling debts for years by shuffling money between offshore accounts and obscure shell companies. He thought his tracks were covered. He thought nobody would ever look closely enough to see that he was completely underwater, borrowing from dangerous creditors just to maintain his country club lifestyle. He had no idea that my company, Apex Holdings, specialized in acquiring and liquidating toxic debt portfolios. "I just intercepted the authorization request from the country club," Vance murmured, watching the screen. $5,400. "Deny it," I said. Vance tapped the enter key. For a long minute, the audio feed was filled only with the sounds of jazz and wealthy men discussing golf handicaps. Then I heard the hesitant footsteps of the waiter returning to the table. "Excuse me, Mr. Pierce?" The waiter said, his voice low and apologetic. "I am terribly sorry, sir, but there seems to be an issue with your card." The transaction was declined. The conversation at the table stopped dead. The silence was sudden and deafening. In a place like Oakwood, a declined card was not just an inconvenience. It was a public humiliation. It was a crack in the armor of wealth that these men wore so proudly. Calvin let out a forced, booming laugh, trying to cover his immediate embarrassment. "Ridiculous. It must be a fraud alert. You know how these banks are always freezing accounts when you spend too much at once. Completely overzealous security. Here, run my platinum card instead." I heard the snap of plastic hitting the silver tray. The waiter murmured a polite apology and walked away. "Hit that one too," I commanded, leaning forward in my chair. Vance did not even blink. "Denied," he said softly. We waited in the dark room, listening intently. Less than 2 minutes later, the waiter returned. This time, his voice was even more strained. Sir, I do not know what to say. This card has also been declined by your financial institution. Calvin slammed his hand on the table, making the silverware rattle. This is unacceptable, he hissed, his voice losing its jovial tone and dropping into something ugly and threatening. Do you know who I am? Do you know how much money I bring into this club? Run the card again. Your machine is clearly broken. I am sorry, sir, the waiter stammered, but the terminal specifically says the accounts have been frozen. The men at the table were completely silent now. The illusion of Calvin's untouchable wealth was shattering right in front of them. I could hear the discomfort in the air. These were men who distanced themselves from financial failure like it was a contagious disease. I will have your job for this embarrassment, Calvin growled, his chair scraping loudly against the floor as he stood up. Get me the club manager right now. You do not need to call him Mr. Pierce. A new voice entered the audio feed. It was Mr. Sterling, the general manager of the Oakwood Country Club. His tone was not apologetic or submissive. It was icy and formal. Sterling? What is the meaning of this? Calvin demanded. Your staff is humiliating me in front of my guests. Fix this immediately. Mr. Sterling did not apologize. Instead, I heard the distinct sound of a heavy manila envelope being placed onto the table. I am afraid the issue is not with our machines, Calvin. 5 minutes ago, our administrative office received an urgent legal injunction from a corporate entity known as Apex Holdings. The name dropped like a bomb. Calvin actually gasped. The sound was wet and panicked. They have placed a total lien on all your known assets. Mr. Sterling continued, his voice projecting clearly so that every man at the table could hear every single word. The injunction cites massive defaulted debts and fraudulent financial practices. Furthermore, because Oakwood requires our members to maintain pristine financial standing, your membership has been suspended, effective immediately pending a full review by the board. There was a collective murmur of shock from Judge Rawlings and the other donors. Calvin was breathing heavily. The sound coming through the microphone was ragged and frantic. He was suffocating on his own ruined pride. This is a mistake, Calvin stammered, his voice shaking uncontrollably. This is a corporate error. Apex Holdings has nothing to do with me. I am a wealthy man. I am funding a senatorial campaign. Please keep your voice down, Calvin, Mr. Sterling said coldly. You are causing a disturbance. I must ask you to leave the dining room immediately. We will send an invoice for your remaining balance to your home address, though I highly doubt your current cards will cover the postage. He was being thrown out. The great Calvin Pierce. The man who cared more about his country club status than his own daughters. Life was being publicly escorted off the premises like a common thief. I closed my eyes and let a long, satisfying breath escape my lungs. The sheer poetic justice of it was intoxicating. I heard Calvin stumbling away from the table, muttering incoherent excuses to his friends, who did not bother to respond. He was practically running. The audio feed shifted from the clatter of the dining room to the echoey tiled acoustics of the men's locker room. A heavy door slammed shut and the deadbolt clicked. Calvin was alone. He was hyperventilating, gasping for air as he frantically tapped at his phone. Vance brought up the call routing screen. He is calling your mother, Vance noted, patching the two-way audio through the main speakers now. The phone rang twice before Gloria answered. She sounded annoyed to be interrupted. Calvin, I am at the spa. What is so urgent that you need to call me in the middle of a hot stone massage? Gloria, we are ruined. Calvin sobbed into the phone, his voice cracking under the weight of his absolute terror. My accounts are frozen, all of them. My black card, my savings, even the joint checking. The club manager just threw me out in front of Judge Rawlings and the entire campaign committee. Gloria's annoyance instantly vanished, replaced by sharp, calculating panic. What do you mean frozen? Who froze them? A company called Apex Holdings, Calvin cried, pacing the locker room floor. His heavy breathing distorted the microphone. They bought my debt, Gloria. They bought the offshore markers, the ones from the casino in Macau, the sports betting lines, everything. You fool! Gloria hissed, venom dripping from her words. You promised me you paid those off years ago. You told me you handled it. I thought I did, Calvin wailed, his voice rising in pitch. I buried the paper trail. I used her social security number and her college fund to cover the worst of it when she turned 18. Nobody was supposed to know. I took every dime she had saved for tuition and routed it to the bookies so they would not break my legs. I thought the debt was wiped clean, but this Apex company dug up the deferred interest and the secondary loans. They found everything. I sat frozen in the bunker, staring at the audio waveform dancing across Vance's screen. The revelation hit me like a physical strike to the chest. My college fund. When I was 18, I had received a letter saying my college savings account had been depleted due to poor stock market investments by my father. My parents had sat me down in the living room, putting on sad faces, telling me the economy had wiped out my future. They told me I would have to take out massive student loans and work multiple jobs if I wanted to get a degree. I had spent 4 years working night shifts at a diner, barely sleeping, eating instant noodles and crying from sheer exhaustion while trying to maintain my grades. I had believed it was just bad luck. He had stolen it. My own father had stolen my education to pay off his illegal gambling debts, and then watched me suffer for years without shedding a single tear. The rage that flared inside me was so bright and hot it threatened to consume the entire room. Calm down and lower your voice, you pathetic idiot! Gloria snapped over the phone, showing absolutely zero remorse for the fact that her husband had robbed their daughter. Tara's college fund does not matter anymore. The girl is dead, lying at the bottom of a frozen ravine. She cannot exactly press charges for financial fraud from the afterlife, can she? But Apex Holdings, Calvin whimpered. They are going to take the house, Gloria. They are going to tell Preston. If Preston finds out I am completely broke and drowning in gambling debt, he will drop us. He will cut off our allowance. He will kick us out of the campaign. Preston is not going to find out anything, Gloria said, her voice returning to its usual cold, calculating rhythm. You are panicking over nothing, Calvin. You always do this. Apex Holdings wants money. We will give them money. We have more than enough coming our way to cover your stupid mistakes. How? Calvin asked desperately. We do not have a dime to our names. Tara's life insurance policy, Gloria stated smoothly. I leaned forward in my chair, locking eyes with Vance. I set it up 5 years ago when she started doing all that dangerous hiking and ecotourism garbage. Gloria continued, her tone almost cheerful now. It is a $2 million comprehensive policy. And since she was unmarried and seemingly unattached, I generously listed myself as the primary beneficiary. With her tragic disappearance and the adoption papers, Preston is rushing through the court. We can have her legally declared dead by the end of the week. $2 million tax-free. Calvin, we pay off this Apex company. We keep the house, and Preston never has to know you are a degenerate gambler. It was brilliant in its pure evil. They were going to use my death to finance their survival. They had planned to cash out my life like a winning lottery ticket. Are you sure we can get the money that fast? Calvin asked, his breathing finally starting to slow down. I am logging into the insurance portal right now on my tablet, Gloria said smugly. I am going to initiate the preliminary claim. The moment the judge signs the death certificate, we will have the funds wired directly to our offshore account. Just relax, Calvin. I always fix your messes. Vance typed, rapidly opening a side window that mirrored the exact insurance portal Gloria was currently accessing. We could see her cursor moving across the screen, typing in my name and her beneficiary credentials. Let her log in, I whispered to Vance, my voice trembling with dark anticipation. Let her see it. Gloria submitted the login request. The portal loading wheel spun for a few seconds over the audio feed. I could hear her humming a pleasant little tune, completely unbothered by the fact that she had murdered her daughter the night before. The screen refreshed. A massive red notification box popped up on Gloria's tablet. "What is this?" Gloria muttered, her humming stopping abruptly. "What is wrong?" Calvin asked, his panic immediately returning. "Gloria, what does it say?" Gloria's voice lost all of its elegant composure. She was reading the screen aloud, her words shaking with confusion and mounting rage. "Access denied. Primary beneficiary status invalid." "What do you mean, invalid?" Calvin shouted. "You said you owned the policy." "I did," Gloria screamed, her voice shrill and panicked. "But the system says the policy was irrevocably altered. It says the beneficiary was changed 48 hours ago." "Changed to who?" Calvin demanded. I watched the screen as Gloria read the final line of the notification. Her voice dropped to a horrified, breathless whisper. "Changed to the Dion Survivor Trust. All funds locked and transferred to the minor child." A long, beautiful silence stretched across the phone line. Calvin and Gloria were completely trapped. They had murdered me for nothing. They had lost their country club status. They had lost their hidden money, and now the $2 million safety net they planned to use to save themselves was locked away in a trust fund solely controlled by the grandson they were trying to give away to a politician. Vance looked at me and offered a rare, slight smile. "Checkmate," I whispered to the dark room, letting the sound of my parents' terrified breathing fill the silence. The following morning brought a storm of panic that I watched unfold from the absolute safety of Vance's underground bunker. Calvin had nowhere left to turn. His country club friends had abandoned him the moment his credit cards bounced. His offshore accounts were frozen by my company. The life insurance policy he planned to use to save himself was locked safely in my son's name. The only person left who had enough money to pull him out of the grave he dug for himself was my brother-in-law Preston. Through the surveillance cameras tapped into Preston's campaign headquarters, I watched my father sweat. The great Calvin Pierce, who usually walked into a room expecting everyone to bow, was now pacing the carpet of Preston's private office like a cornered animal. He kept dabbing his forehead with a silk handkerchief, leaving dark, damp spots on the fabric. Preston walked into the office, shutting the heavy oak door behind him. He looked immaculate in a tailored navy suit, preparing for a press conference later that afternoon. Preston did not offer my father a drink. He did not even offer him a seat. He just leaned against the edge of his mahogany desk and stared at Calvin with a look of utter disgust. Calvin began to beg. He tripped over his own words as he tried to explain that a hostile corporate entity had frozen his assets due to a minor accounting error. He asked Preston for a short-term loan of $500,000 just to cover the immediate margin calls from his bookies and save the family home from foreclosure. Preston did not show an ounce of sympathy. Instead, the mask of the wholesome family man completely vanished. Preston laughed, a cold, sharp sound that echoed through the hidden microphones. He told Calvin that he was a pathetic old fool. Preston reminded my father that he married into this family for political optics. He needed a respected black family to stand behind him on the debate stage to prove to the voters that he was a progressive man of the people. Preston said he bought their house. He paid for Gloria's expensive charity galas, and he funded their entire lifestyle in exchange for their perfect public image. He leaned directly into Calvin's face and whispered that he was not a piggy bank for a degenerate gambler. Preston told Calvin to fix the mess himself and threatened to cut all ties if any of this financial ruin leaked to the press before the election. I watched my father crumble. His shoulders slumped, and he backed out of the office, nodding submissively to the white politician who had just bought and sold his dignity. Calvin had traded his own daughter for prestige, and now he was left with absolutely nothing. Vance handed me a fresh cup of coffee and asked what our next move was. I looked at the screen, tracking Preston's schedule for the day. Preston cared about exactly one thing, which was his pristine public image. His entire campaign was built on the narrative of family values and resilience. He frequently brought Chantel on stage so she could dab at her eyes and talk about the tragic infertility that God had burdened her with. The voters loved her. They wept for the beautiful young wife who wanted nothing more than to be a mother. They donated millions to Preston's campaign because they saw him as a devoted husband, standing by his heartbroken wife. It was time to crack the golden pedestal my sister stood on. I told Vance to pull up the encrypted files we had acquired from a private medical clinic in Bogota, Colombia. Chantel was not infertile by some tragic twist of fate. She had never wanted to be a mother when she was younger. She only cared about her reflection. 7 years ago, when Chantel was obsessed with becoming an Instagram model, she traveled to South America for a series of illegal underground body contouring surgeries. The clinic was cheap and reckless. She developed a severe infection that ravaged her internal organs. The doctors had to perform an emergency hysterectomy to save her life. She had destroyed her own fertility out of pure vanity. But the most sickening part of the truth was how she paid for it. Calvin had taken the last remaining funds from my stolen college account to pay for Chantel's botched surgeries and the subsequent medical cover-up. They had buried the truth and spun a lie that elevated Chantel to a saintly martyr, while I was treated like the selfish daughter who preferred building an ecotourism business over having a traditional family. I gave Vance the signal. He drafted an anonymous, untraceable email from a secure server. The email contained the unredacted Colombian medical records, the emergency room admission forms, and the wire transfers proving Calvin funded the illegal procedure. Vance bypassed Preston's personal assistant and sent the dossier directly to his ruthless campaign manager right in the middle of their morning strategy meeting. We switched the audio feed to the conference room. It took exactly 4 minutes for the campaign manager to open the email. I watched his face go completely pale on the security camera. He abruptly cleared the room, sending the junior staffers away before turning his laptop toward Preston. We could not see the screen from our camera angle, but we did not need to. We saw Preston's reaction. Preston's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. He slammed his fists onto the conference table so hard the water glasses toppled over. The microphone picked up his heavy, jagged breathing. His campaign manager warned him that if this leaked to the opposition, the entire family values platform would be destroyed. The voters would not just see Chantel as a liar, they would see Preston as a fraud, who manufactured a tragic backstory to manipulate the public. Preston did not say a word to his manager. He simply grabbed his keys and stormed out of the office. I told Vance to switch the feed to the mansion Preston shared with my sister. We brought up the living room cameras and waited. Chantel was sitting on a plush white velvet sofa scrolling through her phone while a makeup artist touched up her contouring. She was preparing to record a video for her followers about the difficulties of grief and the blessing of adopting her poor orphaned nephew. The front door flew open with a violent crash. Preston marched into the living room, ignoring the terrified makeup artist. He pointed a shaking finger at the door and told the artist to get out immediately. The woman grabbed her brushes and fled, leaving Chantel staring at her husband in shock. Chantel asked what was wrong, putting on her sweet, innocent voice. Preston pulled out his phone and threw it directly at her. It struck her shoulder and landed on the sofa. He screamed at her, asking if she thought he was a complete idiot. He demanded to know why a Colombian plastic surgery clinic had her listed under an alias for a botched operation that resulted in her infertility. Chantel's perfect facade shattered instantly. The color drained from her face and she scrambled backward against the sofa cushions. She tried to stutter out a denial, but Preston cut her off. He leaned over her, his face twisted in pure rage. He told her he did not care about the surgeries. He did not care about the lies she told him when they were dating. He only cared about the campaign. He told her she was a vain, empty fraud who had put his entire political future in jeopardy because she could not settle for the body she was born with. Chantel began to cry. Real panicked tears, begging Preston to understand that her parents had told her to hide it to protect the family image. Preston sneered at her. He told her that her family was nothing but a pack of parasitic liars dragging him down. He leaned in close and delivered his ultimatum. He told Chantel that if the press got hold of these documents, he would divorce her the very same day. He would leave her with absolutely nothing and ensure she was exiled from every high society circle in the state. The only way she could save her comfortable, wealthy life was to make sure the adoption of Dion went through without a single flaw. He needed the image of the benevolent politician adopting his tragic nephew to bury any potential scandal. Preston told her she had better play the role of the perfect grieving aunt and the perfect new mother, or she would find herself out on the street with her bankrupt parents. Preston turned on his heel and stormed out of the house, leaving Chantel sobbing uncontrollably on the white velvet sofa. I sat back in my chair in the bunker sipping my coffee. The dark satisfaction blooming in my chest was absolute. My sister had spent her entire life tearing me down to make herself look taller. Now the man she worshipped had reduced her to nothing more than a political liability. But Chantel was desperate, and a desperate narcissist is a dangerous thing. She wiped her ruined makeup from her face and grabbed her phone. Through the camera feed, I saw the frantic calculation in her eyes. She needed to prove to Preston and to the public that she was the perfect mother figure. She needed to solidify the narrative right now before the rumors could even begin to spread. I watched as she marched down the hallway toward the guest room where they were keeping my son. Dion was sitting on the floor playing quietly with a small wooden truck I had bought him for his birthday. Chantel grabbed him by the arm, hauling him to his feet. Dion cried out in surprise, trying to pull away from her grip. Chantel ignored his distress. She dragged him back into the brightly lit living room and shoved him onto the sofa. She quickly fixed her hair, wiped her smudged mascara, and positioned her phone on a tripod facing the sofa. She was going to broadcast a live video to her hundreds of thousands of followers, using my terrified, grieving son as a prop to validate her existence. Chantel hit the button to start the live stream. I watched the viewer count skyrocket instantly as her loyal followers tuned in to see the brave sister-in-law speaking out after my tragic death. Chantel wrapped a forceful arm around Dion's shoulders, pulling him tightly against her side. Dion was stiff with discomfort, his eyes darting around the room, looking for a way to escape. Chantel put on a trembling, brave voice. She looked into the camera and thanked everyone for their prayers during this incredibly dark time in their lives. She forced a tragic smile and said that while the loss of her sister was a heavy burden, God had blessed her and Preston with the opportunity to raise sweet little Dion as their own. She squeezed Dion's shoulder and told the camera that love conquers tragedy and that they were already building a beautiful, happy home together. Then she made a fatal mistake. She tried to force Dion to participate in the performance. She turned her face toward him, bringing her cheek close to his, and told him in a sugary sweet tone to say hello to everyone and tell them how much he loved his new mommy. Dion stared at her. He was only 6 years old, but he had my spirit. He had spent his entire life watching his aunt treat me with disdain, and he knew exactly who she was. As Chantel leaned her face closer, waiting for him to play his part, Dion's expression changed. He leaned back, his small nose wrinkling in disgust. He did not say hello. He did not say he loved her. Instead, he looked directly at the camera and spoke with the piercing clarity that only a child possesses. He told her to let him go. He said she was hurting his arm. Chantel tried to laugh it off, maintaining her tight grip, keeping her eyes on the camera as the comments began to flood the screen, asking if the boy was okay. She whispered through gritted teeth, telling him to smile. Dion fought back. He twisted his body, trying to break free from her manicured claws. Chantel grabbed his wrist tightly, digging her nails in to keep him in the frame. Dion let out a sharp cry of pain. He turned his head and bit down hard on her hand. Chantel shrieked in pain and shock, letting go of him instantly. She broke character completely, her face twisting into an ugly mask of pure rage as she raised her hand to strike him. Dion scrambled backward over the sofa cushions, putting distance between them. He pointed his small finger at her and screamed at the top of his lungs. He yelled that he hated her. He yelled that she was not his mother. And then his voice broke completely, and he screamed the words that would echo across the internet forever. He told her to stay away from him because she smelled like the poison tea she gave his mommy. The live stream captured every single second of it. It captured Chantel's raised hand, her furious face, and the terrified, truthful scream of a child accusing his aunt of poisoning his mother. The viewer count had reached over 50,000 people. The comment section exploded into a rapid-fire blur of shock, confusion, and horrifying realization. Chantel lunged for the tripod, her face a mask of absolute terror. She knocked the phone to the ground, fumbling frantically to end the broadcast and delete the stream. The screen on our end went black as she finally managed to cut the feed. I sat in the bunker staring at the dark monitor. My heart was pounding a fierce, triumphant rhythm against my ribs. Chantel thought she could delete the video, but the internet never forgets. Within seconds, Vance showed me screen recordings of the live stream surfacing on different platforms. People had captured the entire incident. They had heard the terror in my son's voice. They had heard the words poison tea. The carefully constructed, wholesome image Preston and Chantel had spent millions to build was currently burning to the ground in real time. The public was no longer looking at a tragic family pulling together in a time of need. They were looking at a terrified child accusing his wealthy, powerful family of murder. Vance leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the chaotic metrics scrolling across his screens as the video went viral. He asked if I wanted to intervene and pull Dion out of the house tonight. I shook my head slowly, watching the chaos unfold. "Not yet," I said softly, my voice hard and resolute. "If I pull him out now, Preston will claim it was a kidnapping. He will use his political power to twist the narrative. I need them to destroy themselves completely. I need Preston to turn on my parents to save his own skin. Let them feel the heat of the fire they started. We wait for the smoke to clear, and then we strike the match that burns their entire legacy to ash." The internet is a relentless machine, and once it catches the scent of blood, it never stops. The video of Chantel's disastrous live stream spread faster than a forest fire. Within hours, the clip of my 6-year-old son screaming about poison tea was trending on every major social media platform. Local news stations picked it up by the morning broadcast. They played the clip over and over, analyzing the sheer terror in Dion's voice and the flash of pure rage on Chantel's face before the feed cut out. The public outcry was immediate and deafening. People were slowing down the footage, enhancing the audio, and dissecting every micro-expression on my sister's face. Armchair detectives were already putting together timelines of my disappearance, linking it to Preston's suspiciously timed adoption filings. People were demanding welfare checks on my son. Reporters were camping outside Preston's gated estate, pushing microphones through the wrought iron bars. The carefully curated image of the compassionate politician rescuing his orphaned nephew was completely obliterated. I sat in the secure bunker, watching the news feeds cycle through the same catastrophic headlines. Vance had his feet propped up on his desk, monitoring the real-time polling data for Preston's senatorial campaign. The numbers were plummeting at a staggering rate. Preston had built his entire platform on family values and moral superiority. Now the voters were watching a child accuse his prominent family of murder. Preston's donors were panicking. His campaign manager was issuing frantic no-comment statements while desperately trying to arrange emergency press conferences that kept getting canceled. Preston was bleeding political capital, and I knew exactly how a man like him would react. He would look for someone to blame. Vance had placed hidden microphones and microcameras throughout Preston's mansion months ago, when my blind LLC Apex Holdings had quietly acquired the security firm that serviced the estate. We had eyes and ears in every room. I watched the feed from Preston's private study. The room was a monument to his ego, filled with dark mahogany leather-bound books and framed photos of himself shaking hands with powerful men. Preston was pacing behind his massive desk, his face a mask of purple rage. He had summoned my parents, Calvin and Gloria, demanding they answer for the disaster. The heavy oak doors opened and my parents scurried into the room looking like terrified mice. Chantel was already sitting on the sofa, her eyes swollen from crying, clutching a tissue and refusing to look at her husband. Calvin tried to put on his usual arrogant country club facade, but it crumbled the moment he saw Preston's face. Preston did not offer them a seat. He did not offer them a drink. He walked around the desk and got right into my father's face. "What the hell is wrong with you people?" Preston roared, his voice vibrating with absolute fury. You told me the boy was under control. You told me he believed the story about the hiking accident. And now he is on live television accusing my wife of feeding his mother poison. Calvin stammered, holding his hands up defensively. Preston, please, you have to understand the boy is confused. He is grieving. Children say crazy things when they are traumatized. We can get a doctor to sign a statement saying he is having delusions. Preston slapped his hand down on the desk, making my parents jump. I do not care about a doctor's note, Calvin. Preston spat. I care that my poll numbers just dropped 12 points in a single morning. I care that my top donors are pulling their funding because they do not want to be associated with a family of alleged murderers. Gloria stepped forward, trying to use her elegant diplomatic voice. Preston, dear, we will fix this. We will keep Dion away from the cameras. We will send him to a private boarding facility until the election is over. Out of sight, out of mind. Preston turned his venom on my mother, his face twisted into a sneer of pure elitist disgust. Shedding his progressive politician persona entirely, Preston revealed the racist, arrogant core he usually kept hidden from the voters. Do not patronize me, Gloria, Preston shouted, pointing a finger at her chest. You people are nothing without me. Do you really think I married your vapid daughter because I loved this family? I married into this family for the optics. I needed a respectable black family to stand behind me on the debate stage so I could secure the minority vote and pretend I am a man of the people. I bought you. I bought your massive house, Calvin. I paid for your lavish lifestyle, Gloria. I funded your entire existence so you would stand there and smile for the cameras. My parents stood frozen in humiliated silence. The powerful white politician they had sold their souls to was reminding them that they were nothing but purchased accessories. Preston leaned in, his voice dropping to a dangerous hiss. You are going to fix that brat right now. You are going to make him go on camera and say he made it all up because he was having a bad dream. You will fix him before I pull every dime of my funding and let you rot in the streets where you belong. I watched the absolute degradation of my parents through the monitor. They had traded their own daughter for a seat at Preston's table, and now they were being treated like stray dogs. But as satisfying as it was to watch Preston tear them apart, it was not enough. They needed to lose everything. They needed the law to come crashing down on their heads. I looked over at Vance. It is time, I said softly. Release the financial documents. Vance nodded. His fingers danced across the keyboard as he accessed the secure servers. We had spent the last 2 days digging through the deepest, darkest corners of Calvin's financial history. When my father was thrown out of the Oakwood Country Club because Apex Holdings froze his accounts, he had panicked. He had massive gambling debts that he had previously paid off by stealing from my college fund. But once my college fund was empty, the gambling did not stop. Calvin needed cash to maintain his high roller status at the club and keep the dangerous bookies off his back. So Calvin had gotten creative. As a trusted family member, he had been given limited access to Preston's campaign finance accounts to manage small community donations. Calvin thought he was a mastermind. He had set up dummy vendor accounts using the names of dead people and completely fabricated invoices for campaign events that never happened. He had submitted invoices for voter outreach programs in districts where Preston had never even held a rally. It was sloppy, lazy thievery born out of pure, arrogant entitlement. Calvin assumed because he was the father-in-law to the great Preston that no one would ever dare audit his expense reports. He had been quietly siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars directly out of Preston's political fund and routing it into offshore accounts to pay for his poker losses and expensive cigars. It was a federal crime. It was campaign finance fraud, wire fraud, and embezzlement all wrapped into one neat, incredibly illegal package. Vance took the unredacted bank statements, the fake invoices, and the offshore routing numbers and bundled them into a secure file. He sent the entire package anonymously to the lead investigative journalist at the city's biggest news network. He also sent it to the Federal Election Commission and the state authorities just to be absolutely thorough. Within 30 minutes, the breaking news alerts began to flash across the monitors in our bunker. The local news anchor interrupted the regular broadcast with an urgent update. Anonymous whistleblowers had provided incontrovertible proof that the campaign of aspiring state Senator Preston was plagued by massive financial fraud. The anchor detailed how hundreds of thousands of dollars in donor funds had been embezzled by a senior family member. They displayed the forged invoices on the screen. They showed the routing numbers leading directly to Calvin's personal offshore accounts. The media did not just have a scandal anymore. They had a federal investigation. The fallout was instantaneous. We watched the cameras in Preston's study as his phone began to ring incessantly. Then Chantel's phone started ringing. Then Calvin's. Preston snatched his phone off the desk and answered it. It was his campaign manager screaming so loudly we could hear the frantic voice through the phone's speaker. Preston listened for exactly 10 seconds. The remaining color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. He slowly lowered the phone and turned to look at my father. Calvin's phone was still buzzing in his pocket. He looked at Preston with wide, terrified eyes. "Preston, what is happening?" Calvin asked, his voice trembling. Preston did not say a word. He walked over to the heavy crystal decanter on his side table and poured himself a glass of whiskey. His hands were shaking so badly the glass clinked loudly against the crystal stopper. He took a long, slow drink. Then, without any warning, Preston hurled the heavy crystal glass directly at Calvin's head. The glass missed my father by an inch, shattering violently against the mahogany doorframe. Shards of crystal and drops of amber liquid rained down on the carpet. Chantel screamed, covering her head. Gloria gasped, shrinking back against the wall. "You stole from me!" Preston roared, his voice cracking with pure feral rage. "You stole campaign funds. You embezzled $500,000 of donor money to pay for your pathetic gambling debts." Calvin threw his hands up, stepping back toward the door. "Preston, please, I can explain. It was a bridge loan. I was going to put the money back. I just needed time to clear a few markers." "You are going to federal prison!" Preston screamed, advancing on my father. "You ruined my campaign. You ruined my life. The feds are going to audit my entire operation because you could not stop playing cards with your country club buddies. I am turning you in, Calvin. I am calling the commissioner right now and handing you over to the feds on a silver platter. I will testify against you myself to save my own skin." Preston pulled out his phone, dialing furiously. Calvin fell to his knees, actually begging, crying, and pleading for mercy. He grasped at Preston's pant leg, sobbing that he would not survive in prison. Preston kicked him away with a look of pure loathing. Just as Preston was about to hit the call button, Gloria lunged forward. "Wait!" Gloria shouted, her voice shrill and desperate. "Wait! Preston, do not call them! We can fix this! We can make this go away!" Preston stopped, looking at my mother with total disgust. "How do you fix federal embezzlement, Gloria? The money is gone. The paper trail is on the evening news." Gloria's eyes were wild, frantically calculating a way out of the destruction. She looked at her husband on his knees, and then looked at Preston. Her face hardened, shifting into a mask of pure, unadulterated evil. She was entirely willing to sacrifice anyone and anything to save her own comfortable lifestyle. "We pin it on Tara," Gloria said, her voice breathless with wicked desperation. Preston frowned, lowering the phone slightly. "What?" "We pin the embezzlement on Tara," Gloria repeated, stepping closer to Preston. "She was the one who had the ecotourism business. She had offshore accounts. We will forge documents showing she hacked into the campaign fund. We will say she stole the money because her own business was failing." Calvin looked up from the floor, catching on to the twisted logic. "Yes," Calvin stammered, wiping his nose. "We can say she stole the money, and when she realized she was going to be caught, she ran away to the mountains. She is dead." Preston, Gloria urged, her eyes wide with manic hope. "She is dead at the bottom of a ravine. She cannot defend herself. She cannot testify. We will tell the feds she was a mentally unstable thief who committed suicide out of guilt when the walls started closing in. We blame the dead girl Preston. It clears your name and it keeps Calvin out of prison. They stood there in the opulent study conspiring to frame their murdered daughter for federal crimes just to save their own miserable skins. They were so thoroughly corrupted, so completely devoid of human decency, that they would use my grave as a shield against their own sins. I sat in the cold, secure bunker, listening to every word through the wiretap. The absolute depravity of my mother taking the lead in framing my corpse was breathtaking. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk, and stared at the monitor showing their terrified, scheming faces. I smiled a slow, dark smile that reached all the way to my eyes. "Checkmate," I whispered to the empty room. The viral video of Dion screaming about the poison tea was the final crack in Preston's carefully manufactured reality. Sitting in his private study with the heavy mahogany doors locked, he watched the clip over and over again on his phone. The color completely drained from his face as the terrifying realization finally hit him. This was not just a child having a random emotional tantrum on a live stream. This was a highly coordinated, targeted attack. Tara was not dead at the bottom of a frozen mountain like Calvin and Gloria had promised. She was alive. She was out there hiding in the shadows, and she was holding all the cards. A deep, visceral terror began to claw at his chest, making it difficult for him to breathe. If she was alive, she had the physical evidence of attempted murder. She had the teacups, she had the timeline, she had the motive. His entire political career, his freedom and his very life were about to be obliterated by a woman they all thought was weak. He grabbed his phone, his hands shaking so badly he could barely unlock the screen. He dialed the number for his lead defense attorney, a ruthless man who specialized in making wealthy people's problems disappear. His voice was cracking as he demanded an immediate emergency court hearing. He paced the length of his expensive Persian rug, telling his lawyers he did not care who they had to bribe or what political favors they had to call in to make this happen. He needed the legal adoption of Dion finalized within 24 hours. His plan was desperate and entirely transparent. If he had full legal custody of my son, he could take him out of the state, away from the cameras and the reporters. He planned to flee to a private compound and use my child as leverage against me to force a silent settlement. He thought he could still outmaneuver a ghost. The next morning, the atmosphere inside the city courthouse was thick with suffocating tension. The emergency family court hearing was strictly closed to the public and the press. Outside the imposing granite building, reporters were swarming like vultures waiting for a statement about the horrifying viral video that had consumed the morning news cycle. Preston had forced my family to arrive through the underground loading dock to avoid the cameras. The ride in his armored SUV had been completely silent, the air heavy with unspoken panic and mutual hatred. Inside the private chambers, Preston was putting on the performance of a lifetime. The room was completely silent except for the muffled sound of Chantel crying fake tears. She sat beside Preston, clutching a crumpled tissue to her face, sobbing softly into his shoulder. She wore a modest black dress, her hair pulled back simply to look the part of the exhausted, heartbroken sister trying to hold her family together in the face of public scrutiny. Calvin and Gloria sat right behind them in the gallery, nodding solemnly and trying to project an image of quiet, dignified grief. They were all playing their parts perfectly, hoping the legal system would give them the shield they so desperately needed. Preston's high-powered lawyer stood before the judge, spinning a web of absolute lies. He claimed that the viral video was a tragic result of severe emotional trauma caused by my supposed mental instability. He argued that my sudden disappearance and presumed death had pushed the young boy over the edge, causing him to lash out with wild, imaginative accusations about poison. The lawyer leaned heavily on the desk, putting deep sadness into his voice, as he told the judge that Dion needed the immediate, stable, and wealthy environment that only Preston and Chantel could provide. He painted me as a monster, describing how my son had suffered under the care of a deeply unhinged mother. He urged the judge to sign the final adoption papers right then and there to protect the child from the media circus and the psychological damage of the foster system. The judge was a stern-looking man with thick white hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. He looked over the forged psychiatric records that Calvin had submitted to the court days earlier. He adjusted his glasses, reading through the false reports of my delusions and violent tendencies. He seemed completely convinced by the pristine performance my family was putting on. The fabricated documents were thorough, detailing years of fake therapy sessions and prescribed medications I had never taken. The judge reached into his black robe and pulled out a heavy gold pen. He lowered the tip of the pen toward the signature line on the final adoption decree, ready to make the nightmare official and hand my son over to monsters. I watched all of this unfold through a secure encrypted feed Vance had managed to tap into the courthouse's internal security camera system. I held my breath, staring at the screen from the safety of the underground bunker, waiting for our move. Just as the gold pen touched the thick parchment paper, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a massive thud. The noise echoed through the quiet chamber like a gunshot. Every head in the room snapped around to look at the entrance. Vance walked down the center aisle. He wore a flawless charcoal suit, his face a mask of absolute, unyielding authority. He did not stop at the wooden barrier that separated the gallery from the court. He did not ask the bailiff for permission to enter. His leather shoes clicked sharply against the polished marble floor as he marched straight past my terrified parents. He walked directly to the front of the room and slammed a massive leather briefcase right onto the judge's wooden bench. The violent sound made Chantel jump in her seat and drop her tissue to the floor. Preston's lawyer immediately began shouting objections, waving his arms and demanding that this unauthorized personnel be removed from the courtroom by armed security. Preston stood up, his face flushing red with anger, telling the judge that this was a private hearing. Vance did not even look at them. He kept his dark eyes locked entirely on the judge. Vance spoke in a smooth, carrying voice, stating clearly that he was the legal executor of my estate and the sole managing attorney of my blind trust. He announced to the silent room that he was formally and legally blocking the adoption of my son. He stated that he held a sealed affidavit and undeniable forensic evidence that would prove the entire foundation of their petition was a massive criminal fraud. The judge slowly lowered his pen, his expression shifting from confusion to serious attention. He ordered Preston's lawyer to sit down and be quiet immediately. He then asked Vance to explain his explosive accusations and present his evidence to the court. Vance popped the brass locks on his briefcase. He did not just pull out my real medical records to prove I had no history of psychiatric issues. He pulled out thick-bound stacks of digital forensic logs. He handed the files up to the judge, explaining methodically that the psychiatric hold document submitted by my father was a complete and total fabrication. Vance laid out the internet protocol, addresses, the server timestamps, and the digital footprints that traced the forged document directly back to a specific computer. He showed the judge the exact hour and minute that Calvin had illegally accessed the county portal using a stolen password to upload the fake records. Vance did not stop there. He provided the metadata showing exactly how the forgery was committed. He explained that my signature had been digitally lifted from a birthday card I had signed for Calvin's 50th birthday 5 years ago. Vance showed the forensic analysis, proving how the ink colors had been digitally manipulated and pasted onto the fraudulent medical form to make it look authentic. He handed over the exact software logs from Calvin's personal computer at his wealth management firm, proving he was the one who manufactured the entire lie. Calvin began to sweat profusely. His hands trembled uncontrollably as he stared down at his expensive leather shoes. A dark, damp stain began to spread across the collar of his custom-tailored shirt. He knew he was caught, and he knew there was no way to buy his way out of a digital paper trail that clear. Gloria gripped the edge of the wooden bench in front of her, her face turning a sickly shade of ash gray as she realized her husband had left a massive trail of evidence that would destroy them all. She started taking short, shallow breaths, clutching the pearl necklace at her throat as if she were choking on the reality of her own actions. Preston tried to intervene, his voice cracking slightly as he claimed this was an outrageous stunt orchestrated by political rivals to ruin his campaign. He demanded the judge ignore the documents and focus on the welfare of the child. He tried to use his political weight, implying that he would have the judge's seat challenged in the next election if the adoption was not finalized today. The judge silenced him with a harsh, violent strike of his wooden gavel. The white-haired man looked through the forensic reports, turning page after page, as the grim reality of the situation washed over him. His expression turned from professional curiosity to absolute furious outrage. He realized he had been manipulated and was seconds away from being made an accomplice to kidnapping and fraud by a wealthy family who thought they were above the law. He looked down at my parents and Preston with absolute burning disgust. He struck his gavel again and declared that not only was the adoption suspended indefinitely, but he was ordering an immediate full-scale FBI investigation into the forged signatures and the submission of fraudulent documents to a state court. The judge looked directly into Calvin's terrified eyes and stated that federal authorities would be seizing his computers, his hard drives, and all his financial records by the end of the business day. Chantel let out a real cry of terror, this time wrapping her arms around her stomach as she realized the walls were finally closing in on her perfect life. Her fake tears were replaced by genuine sobbing as she looked at her husband for help. Preston stood entirely frozen, his jaw tight, his political career and his entire future evaporating right in front of his eyes. The judge adjourned the emergency hearing immediately and stormed out of the room, leaving my family sitting in the silent wreckage of their own arrogant crimes. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Vance packed up his briefcase with calm, deliberate movements, snapping the brass locks shut. He turned and walked out into the bright marble hallway of the courthouse, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the large, empty space. Preston followed him out, his face twisted with desperate, animalistic rage. Preston marched down the corridor and cornered Vance against the wall near the heavy brass elevator doors blocking his path. Preston pushed his way right into Vance's personal space, his breathing heavy and erratic, smelling like stale coffee and pure panic. Preston threatened him in a low, vicious whisper, telling Vance he had no idea who he was messing with in this city. Preston said he would destroy Vance's law license, ruin his practice, and bury him under so much endless litigation that he would never see the inside of a courtroom again. He promised to make Vance regret the day he ever heard the name Tara Pierce. Vance did not flinch. He did not step back or show a single ounce of fear in the face of the angry politician. He simply stood there with absolute stillness, letting Preston's empty threats wash over him. Then Vance reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick, glossy envelope. He calmly adjusted his silk tie, brushing a piece of invisible lint from his lapel before handing the envelope to Preston. Preston took it, his hands shaking with residual adrenaline, and pulled the heavy cardstock from inside. It was a VIP invitation to his very own upcoming campaign fundraiser scheduled for this coming Saturday night at the Grand Ballroom downtown. Vance looked Preston dead in the eye with a terrifyingly calm smile playing on his lips. "My client suggests you make sure your in-laws are on their best behavior this Saturday." Senator Vance said, his voice as smooth and cold as glass. "The dead do not like to be kept waiting." Vance's words in the courthouse hallway hung over Preston like a death sentence, but the legal blockade was only the beginning of my plan. I did not just want to ruin my family in a court of law, I wanted to dismantle them psychologically. I wanted to break their minds so completely that they would welcome the confines of a prison cell just to escape the terror of their own lives. My sister and my parents had spent years gaslighting me, making me feel crazy and worthless. Now it was my turn to play with their reality. Vance had not just compromised the security cameras at the estate, he had completely infiltrated their entire digital ecosystem. We had access to their smart home devices, their personal phones, and the audio feeds in their vehicles. I spent hours in the bunker listening to their frantic, panicked conversations, watching them tear each other apart as the pressure mounted. It was a symphony of destruction, and I was the conductor. Through our acquired security access, it was terrifyingly easy for one of Vance's operatives to slip into the mansion while the family was out scrambling to do damage control for Preston's collapsing campaign. Chantel was the first to feel the weight of my invisible hands. She woke up on a quiet Thursday morning, the pale sunlight streaming through the sheer curtains of her massive master bedroom. She stretched lazily until she took her first deep breath of the morning air. Her eyes snapped open, her heart rate instantly spiking. The entire room was thick with the scent of my signature perfume. It was a rare custom blend of jasmine and dark vanilla that I had worn every single day for the last 8 years. Chantel scrambled backward, scrambling across the expensive silk sheets until her back hit the headboard. She pulled the blankets up to her chest, gasping for air, as the undeniable scent of her murdered sister wrapped around her like a suffocating blanket. She did not just scream, she began to tear the room apart. She ripped the heavy silk curtains off the windows, looking for hidden speakers or cameras. She emptied her vanity, throwing expensive makeup and glass bottles against the wall, convinced I was hiding in the shadows laughing at her. When the maids came running in, she grabbed one by the shoulders, shaking her, and demanding to know who had smuggled the perfume into the house. When Preston returned home that evening, he found his wife sitting in the corner of the dark bedroom, rocking back and forth. She grabbed his suit jacket, sobbing hysterically, telling him that my ghost was haunting the estate, that I was walking the halls, waiting to drag her to hell. Preston looked at his wife with absolute revulsion. His political career was in free fall, and the last thing he needed was a hysterical wife. He roughly pried her fingers off his lapel, telling her she was having a pathetic psychotic break, and that she needed to drug herself into silence before she humiliated him further. His complete lack of empathy only drove the wedge between them deeper, leaving Chantel heavily medicated on prescription anxiety pills just to make it through the day. Gloria was the next target on my list. My mother had always prided herself on her immaculate appearance, and her collection of expensive vintage silk scarves was her most prized possession. They were symbols of the wealth and status she had traded my life to acquire. On Friday afternoon, she walked into her opulent walk-in closet to select an outfit for a campaign damage control luncheon. She slid open the custom velvet-lined accessory drawer, and the breath completely left her lungs. She let out a high-pitched, blood-curdling shriek that echoed through the entire wing of the mansion. Every single one of her precious silk scarves had been slashed perfectly in half. The sharp, clean cuts left the vibrant fabrics ruined and frayed. The edges were completely destroyed, leaving nothing but colorful ribbons of shredded silk. It was not just vandalism, it was a highly specific, meticulously calculated message. An echo from a past she thought she had buried. Years ago, when we were in high school, I had spent months working on a painting for a prestigious state art competition. I had won first place, taking home a massive trophy and a scholarship, completely outshining Chantel's pathetic third-place finish at a local beauty pageant. The very next morning, I had woken up to find all of my favorite clothes slashed to ribbons in my closet. Gloria had done it. She had destroyed my things to punish me for making her golden child feel inferior. She had looked me dead in the eye and told me a burglar must have broken in, daring me to call her a liar. Now kneeling in her own ruined sanctuary, Gloria knew exactly what was happening. The blood drained from her face, and a cold sweat broke out across her forehead. She gathered the ruined fabric in her shaking hands, staring at the perfectly straight razor cuts. The overwhelming terror of facing a daughter who no longer knew her place paralyzed her. She knew I was not a ghost haunting the house. She knew I was a predator, methodically circling my prey, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Calvin and Gloria spent the rest of the day jumping at every shadow, terrified of their own reflections. The relentless psychological torment culminated on the night of Preston's multi-million-dollar campaign fundraiser. The night arrived with a torrential downpour, but that did not stop the media circus outside the Plaza Hotel. Flashing cameras illuminated the heavy rain as black SUVs pulled up to the red carpet. Preston stepped out first, his jaw locked into a tight, forced smile as he waved to the cameras. Chantel followed, her eyes glazed over from the heavy dose of tranquilizers floating through her bloodstream. She stumbled slightly on the wet pavement, her high heels slipping, but Preston gripped her arm with bruising force, holding her upright like a glamorous rag doll. Calvin and Gloria walked behind them, shielding their faces from the blinding camera flashes, pretending they were just a grieving family trying to support their son-in-law. Reporters shouted questions about the federal embezzlement investigation and the viral video of Dion. But the heavy security detail pushed them back, allowing the family to escape into the opulent lobby of the hotel. The grand ballroom was packed to capacity with the entire political elite of the state, wealthy corporate donors, and a ravenous press corps. It was supposed to be Preston's crowning achievement, but before the family had to walk out and face the flashbulbs, they were sequestered in a private VIP dining suite on the upper floor of the hotel. The private dinner was supposed to be a moment of calm before the storm, but the atmosphere inside the suite was suffocating. The four of them sat around a circular mahogany table picking at plates of expensive filet mignon that tasted like ash in their mouths. Calvin and Gloria were sweating profusely, their eyes darting nervously toward the heavy wooden doors every time a waiter entered the room to clear a plate. Chantel was practically vibrating in her seat, heavily medicated on her dangerous cocktail of anxiety pills. Her hands shook so badly, she could barely lift her crystal water glass to her lips, her pupils dilated and unfocused. Preston sat at the head of the table, radiating pure, toxic fury. He looked at the three trembling messes of human beings sitting around him and felt nothing but contempt. He wiped his mouth with a linen napkin and leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. His voice was a low, dangerous whisper that cut through the silence of the room like a scalpel. "Smile, wave, and play the grieving family." Preston ordered, his eyes locking onto Calvin's sweating face. "If anything goes wrong tonight, if any of you step out of line, break character, or look like anything other than perfect tragic victims, I am throwing all three of you to the wolves. I will hand you to the feds myself. You will walk out to that ballroom and you will force the biggest, most convincing fake smiles you have ever worn in your miserable lives." Calvin swallowed hard, nodding submissively as Preston stood up and walked toward the suite doors to speak with his campaign manager. The moment Preston was out of earshot, Gloria reached under the table and gripped Calvin's arm with terrifying strength. Her manicured nails dug so deeply into his suit jacket that he winced, pulling him closer so she could whisper aggressively into his ear. She was entirely consumed by survival, instinct willing to double down on her own lies rather than admit defeat. "If she is alive and shows up tonight, we stick to the plan," Gloria hissed, her eyes wide and manic as she looked at her husband. "We do not falter. She is schizophrenic, Calvin. She faked her death for attention because she was sick with jealousy over Chantel's perfect life. We completely deny the audio. We tell the press it is a malicious, deep fake designed by political rivals to ruin Preston's campaign. We are the victims here. Do not make us look like liars, Calvin. You stick to the script." Calvin nodded frantically, taking a shaky sip of his wine as he tried to internalize the lies they were going to spin to the press. They were both so entirely focused on their own web of deception that they did not notice the small glowing ring on the sleek smart home speaker sitting on the credenza in the corner of the private suite. Preston walked back to the table, adjusting his tie, preparing to lead them down to the grand ballroom, where he would step up to the podium and give his emotional speech about family values and resilience after tragedy. But before anyone could take a single step toward the door, the room fell deathly silent. The smart home speaker emitted a soft chime indicating it had been activated remotely. Then a crystal-clear audio recording echoed through the private dining suite, bouncing off the expensive wallpaper and filling the heavy air. It was a recording from the dark Appalachian woods, loud and unmistakable. "We already told him you died," came Gloria's cold, laughing voice from the speaker. "Do not make us liars." The audio clicked off, leaving a deafening ringing silence in its wake. Preston froze, his hand hovering over the doorknob. Chantel dropped her glass, letting it shatter against the hardwood floor. Calvin and Gloria turned slowly toward the speaker, the remaining color draining from their faces until they looked like corpses. The family sat trapped in the luxurious suite, staring at each other in absolute blood-curdling horror, finally realizing that there was nowhere left to run. The absolute terror in that private suite was palpable. But Preston was not a man who surrendered his power easily. He broke the frozen silence by slamming his fist against the table, shattering a water glass. He grabbed Chantel by the arm, hauling her to her feet while screaming at Calvin and Gloria to get up. He told them that the smart speaker was just a hacker trying to scare them, and that they still had a room full of donors downstairs waiting for a speech. Preston was running on pure adrenaline and denial. He forced his trembling, completely broken family out of the suite and marched them down the grand marble staircase toward the main ballroom. They were walking directly into my trap. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was a sea of glittering wealth and political power. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the state senators, top corporate donors, wealthy lobbyists, and a ravenous press corps. The media was practically vibrating with anticipation, following the disastrous morning news cycle involving the embezzlement leaks and the viral video of my terrified son. Preston had promised them a speech that would address the tragedy, clear his name, and reaffirm his commitment to family values. He needed this night to save his campaign and his freedom. Preston marched onto the stage, the perfect picture of a resilient leader standing tall in his tailored suit. Chantel sat in the front row with Calvin and Gloria, their faces arranged into tight, identical masks of practiced grief. Preston gripped the edges of the mahogany podium. He leaned into the microphone, his voice thick with manufactured emotion. He talked about the trials his family had faced. He spoke of resilience in the face of unspeakable tragedy. He praised his beautiful wife Chantel for her unwavering strength after the sudden heartbreaking loss of her dear sister. He told the crowd that faith and family were the only things keeping them grounded. Just as Preston raised his hand to wipe an invisible tear from his eye, the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the ballroom slammed shut with a deafening crash. The sheer force of the impact echoed through the cavernous space like a gunshot. The heavy brass deadbolts engaged, automatically locking from the inside with a sharp metallic clack that made the front row jump in their seats. A collective murmur of confusion rippled through the wealthy crowd. Preston tapped the microphone, but it was completely dead. The audio feed had been severed by Vance's operatives. The bright golden lights of the chandeliers abruptly flickered and died, plunging the entire ballroom into near darkness. Before panic could fully take hold of the room, two massive theatrical spotlights positioned in the balcony swung around, cutting through the darkness. The blinding white beams converged at the back of the room right as the secondary double doors swung open. I walked into the light. I was not wearing the torn, muddy rags I had died in. I was not the broken, terrified woman who had tumbled down the side of a mountain choking on poisoned tea while my family watched. I stepped onto the rich crimson carpet wearing a breathtaking razor-sharp emerald green suit. The tailoring was flawless, cutting a striking, powerful silhouette that demanded absolute attention. My hair was perfectly styled, falling in dark waves over my shoulders, and my face showed absolutely no mercy. I looked powerful. I looked untouched by the grave they had dug for me. I looked completely untouchable. I was the ghost they had tried to bury, but I had returned as an executioner. The silence in the ballroom was absolute for a fraction of a second before the chaos erupted. Gloria let out a blood-curdling scream that tore from her throat. Her fingers went limp, and the expensive crystal champagne glass she was holding slipped from her hand, shattering into 1,000 glittering pieces on the polished hardwood floor. Calvin stumbled backward, his foot catching on the leg of a chair. He scrambled to keep his balance, knocking over an entire floral centerpiece as he grabbed the edge of a banquet table, gasping for air, as if the room had suddenly lost all oxygen. Chantel did not even try to stand. Her heavily medicated mind completely fractured under the weight of her guilt. She collapsed directly onto her knees, tearing the delicate silk of her expensive couture dress. She began sobbing and shaking her head violently from side to side, refusing to believe that I was standing there breathing and alive. The wealthy donors and political elites erupted into a frenzy of shocked murmurs and confused shouts. The press corps realized what was happening a split second later. A blinding wave of camera flashes exploded, illuminating the darkness as every photographer in the room scrambled to capture the impossible sight of the murdered sister walking into her own memorial fundraiser. The clicking of the camera shutters sounded like a swarm of locusts. Preston was losing his mind. His face turned a mottled shade of violet. He gripped the edge of the podium so hard his knuckles turned bone white. He pointed a shaking finger at me across the massive ballroom, shouting frantically over the roar of the crowd into the dead microphone. "Security!" he screamed, his voice cracking with pure desperation. "Get this crazy woman out of here right now. She is an imposter. She is a fake. Arrest her immediately." I did not break my stride. I walked straight up the center aisle, my emerald green heels clicking rhythmically against the floor. The sea of wealthy donors parted for me, backing away as if I were made of fire. 4 massive private security guards in dark suits rushed forward from the perimeter of the room, moving to intercept me before I could reach the stage. Before their hands could even graze the fabric of my suit, Vance materialized from the shadows of the front row. He stepped directly into their path, blocking them with the solid, immovable presence of a brick wall. He did not shout or raise his fists. Instead, he reached into his jacket and flashed a stack of heavily stamped federal injunction papers right in the face of the lead guard. "Federal jurisdiction," Vance said, his voice slicing through the noise with chilling, absolute authority. "Lay one hand on my client, and you will spend the next 10 years in federal prison for obstructing an ongoing criminal investigation. Stand down right now." The security guards hesitated, looking from the federal seals on the documents to Preston's panicked face on the stage. They slowly backed away, lowering their hands and stepping aside. Vance gave me a slight nod, and I continued my walk up the short flight of stairs to the stage. Preston backed away from the podium, stumbling over the microphone cord. He looked like a cornered rat trapped in the glare of 100 flashing cameras. I stepped right up to the podium, replacing him at the center of the stage. Vance, who had commandeered the audio control board at the side of the stage, flicked a single switch. The microphone hummed back to life with a sharp feedback squeal that made the crowd cover their ears. I leaned into the microphone, looking out at the sea of terrified faces, flashing cameras, and my broken family shivering in the front row. "Good evening, voters," I said, my voice echoing off the high vaulted ceiling, smooth and crystal clear. "I apologize for missing my own funeral. I know it must be terribly inconvenient for the campaign." I paused, letting the dead silence of the room amplify my next words. I looked directly at my mother, whose face was buried in her trembling hands. Turns out the bears in the Blackwood Reserve did not find my flesh quite as toxic as my mother's tea, I said. A collective gasp ripped through the ballroom. The press went absolutely rabid, shouting questions, shoving microphones toward the stage, stepping over each other to get a better angle. The donors looked horrified, backing away from the front row where my family was unraveling. The accusation of poisoning, delivered live in front of the entire state media, was the final nail in the coffin of Preston's political career. The room was spinning out of control, but my mother was a survivor in the most parasitic sense of the word. The initial shock wore off, and her wicked, manipulative nature violently reasserted itself. She realized this was the absolute end of her wealth, her status and her freedom unless she discredited me right this second. Gloria clawed her way to her feet, stepping over the shattered crystal of her champagne glass. She rushed the edge of the stage, throwing her arms out in a desperate theatrical display. Fake tears streamed down her perfectly contoured face, smudging her expensive makeup. Oh, my poor sick daughter, Gloria cried, projecting her voice so the press could capture every single syllable of her tragic performance. You are alive. Thank God you are alive. But you are so sick. You have had another hallucination. Someone call an ambulance immediately. She is severely schizophrenic. She does not know what she is saying. She needs to be institutionalized right now before she hurts herself again. Gloria stood there playing the weeping, desperate mother, trying to gaslight a room of 1,000 people, just like she had gaslighted me my entire life. She was trying to use the fake psychiatric records they had forged to legally bury me. She thought if she screamed loud enough and cried hard enough, she could make everyone believe I was just a crazy woman having a public breakdown. I looked down at her from the stage, resting my hands on the mahogany podium. I felt absolutely no anger anymore. I only felt the cold, beautiful certainty of victory. I let out a low, dark chuckle that echoed through the microphone and rolled across the entire ballroom, silencing the shouting reporters. Institutionalized, I asked, my voice dripping with cold amusement. Let us check the tape, Mother. I reached into the pocket of my perfectly tailored emerald green suit and pulled out a small, sleek, black remote control. My thumb hovered over the primary button for just a fraction of a second, savoring the absolute power I held in my hand before I pressed it down with deliberate force. Behind Preston, the massive digital projector screens that spanned the entire width of the stage suddenly glitched. They had been displaying his polished campaign logo, a shining beacon of false integrity and manufactured family values. Now the smiling political logo dissolved into jagged digital static. A low mechanical hum vibrated through the heavy floorboards of the stage as Vance, working from a secure terminal in the shadows, completely overrode the hotel's audiovisual system. The massive screens went entirely black for 2 terrifying seconds. The ballroom held its collective breath. The wealthy donors, the corporate lobbyists, and the eager press corps stood completely frozen, staring up at the empty digital canvas. Then the darkness was violently shattered by the stark, glaring green and white hues of high-definition military-grade infrared footage. It was the raw, unedited feed from the hidden trail cameras Vance had installed deep within the Blackwood Reserve. The image was so crisp and terrifyingly clear that a collective gasp rippled through the massive crowd, echoing off the crystal chandeliers. The video began to play, displaying a snowy, desolate landscape, illuminated by thermal imaging. The biting cold of the mountain was palpable even through the screen. 2 bright white heat signatures appeared on the right side of the frame, trudging heavily through the thick, freezing snow. The entire ballroom of donors and press watched in absolutely stunned silence as the figures came into sharper focus. Even in the stark contrast of infrared, the posture, the movements, and the distinct profiles of my parents were completely undeniable. It was Calvin and Gloria, but they were not walking alone. Between them, they were dragging a third, much fainter heat signature. It was my limp, unconscious body. The camera captured every horrific detail of their struggle. The audience watched my father lose his grip on my ankles, dropping my legs into the deep snow with a callous disregard that made several people in the front row physically recoil and cover their mouths in horror. My mother was shown pulling my shoulders, her expensive winter coat visible even in the thermal distortion. They were dragging me toward the treacherous drop-off at the edge of the ravine, like a piece of unwanted garbage they were trying to discard in the night. Then the audio kicked in. Vance had routed the sound feed directly through the ballroom's massive concert-grade surround sound speakers. The raw, biting wind of the mountain echoed through the elegant dining hall, making the room feel suddenly freezing. The sound of heavy boots crunching through the deep snow filled the silence, followed by the heavy, panicked panting of my parents. Then my father's voice boomed from the speakers, loud and unmistakably cruel, cutting through the luxurious ballroom like a physical blade. "Make it quick!" Calvin's voice echoed through the silent room, his tone dripping with impatience and malice. "Bianca is waiting to take Dion." The reaction in the room was instantaneous and explosive. The silence shattered into a million frantic pieces. Wealthy socialites screamed out loud, dropping their drinks and backing away from the stage in pure animal terror. The press corps went absolutely feral. Camera shutters clicked like machine gun fire, capturing the horrific video playing on the screens and the utterly destroyed faces of my family sitting in the front row. Reporters began shouting questions over each other, their voices a chaotic symphony of disbelief and journalistic adrenaline. Preston realized in a fraction of a second that his entire existence was over. The life he had built on lies, manipulation, and my supposed death was evaporating in front of the very donors he needed to survive. He panicked. His survival instinct kicked into overdrive, and he completely abandoned his carefully crafted image. He stumbled backward away from the podium, his expensive dress shoes slipping on the polished wood of the stage. He threw his hands up in the air, trying to run toward the side exit, screaming frantically into the chaotic crowd, trying to distance himself from the radioactive fallout of my parents' crimes. I did not know he shrieked, his face red with exertion and terror, his voice cracking with desperate, cowardly panic. I swear to God I knew nothing about this. They are monsters. My in-laws are murderers. I had absolutely nothing to do with it. He was trying to save himself, willing to throw his wife and her parents straight into the fire just to preserve his own skin and his political future. He reached the edge of the stage, desperate to vanish into the shadows of the hotel corridors, but I stepped forward, blocking his path. My voice cut through the screaming crowd, amplified by the microphone I had taken from the podium. "Not so fast, Preston," I said, my tone dripping with absolute icy authority. Slide 2. I clicked the remote a second time. The horrifying infrared video of my parents dragging my body vanished from the massive screens, leaving a brief moment of darkness. It was instantly replaced by a crystal-clear, blown-up image of a bank statement. The document was massive, every single letter and number magnified so that even the people standing at the very back of the ballroom could read it clearly. It was Preston's private offshore banking ledger. The crowd fell silent again, their eyes darting rapidly across the screen as they absorbed the irrefutable evidence of his guilt. A bright red box highlighted a specific wire transfer. $250,000 moved directly from Preston's hidden personal account into a shell company controlled entirely by Calvin's wealth management firm. But it was not just the massive amount of money that destroyed him. It was the memo line and the timestamp. The memo was typed out in plain, arrogant English, a testament to their belief that they would never be caught. The text clearly read, "Cleanup crew." The timestamp showed the transaction was completed at 6 in the morning, the exact morning after I disappeared into the frozen mountains. Preston stopped dead in his tracks. His foot hovered over the final step of the stage, his body entirely rigid. He slowly turned his head to look up at the massive screen, and all the remaining fight drained out of his body. He could spin a video, he could blame his in-laws, he could claim ignorance about a murder plot, but he could never explain away $250,000 wired for a cleanup crew just hours after his sister-in-law was thrown off a cliff. His white privilege, his massive political war chest, his expensive defense lawyers, and his powerful friends could not save him from raw, undeniable financial evidence played live in front of the entire state press corps. The wealthy donors, who had just handed him massive checks for his campaign, were now staring at him with absolute disgust, realizing they had just funded a man who paid to cover up a murder. Preston dropped heavily to his knees right there on the edge of the stage. The air seemed to leave his lungs all at once. He leaned over and violently vomited onto the expensive red carpet, his perfect political facade crumbling into a pathetic, sickening mess. He was completely and utterly destroyed. Down in the front row, Chantel was completely catatonic. The dangerous cocktail of anxiety pills and the overwhelming shock of the last 5 minutes had finally caused her brain to simply shut down. She sat heavily on the floor, pulling at her own hair, rocking back and forth, and muttering nonsensical words to herself. She had spent her entire life stepping on my neck to elevate herself, and now she was nothing but a broken shell of a woman sitting in a puddle of her own shattered reality. Calvin sat entirely frozen in his chair, a dark, wet stain spreading across the front of his tailored trousers as his bladder gave way in pure, abject terror. He could not look away from the financial documents on the screen, his mind finally snapping under the weight of his own monstrous actions being broadcast to the entire world. Gloria, however, was a survivor in the most parasitic sense of the word. The initial shock wore off, and her wicked, manipulative nature violently reasserted itself. She realized this was the absolute end of her wealth, her status, and her freedom, unless she discredited me right this second. Gloria clawed her way to her feet, stepping over the shattered crystal of her champagne glass. She rushed the edge of the stage, throwing her arms out in a desperate theatrical display. Fake tears streamed down her perfectly contoured face, smudging her expensive makeup. "Oh, my poor sick daughter!" Gloria cried, projecting her voice so the press could capture every single syllable of her tragic performance. "You are alive. Thank God you are alive. But you are so sick. You have had another hallucination. Someone call an ambulance immediately. She is severely schizophrenic. She does not know what she is saying. She needs to be institutionalized right now before she hurts herself again." Gloria stood there playing the weeping, desperate mother, trying to gaslight a room of 1,000 people, just like she had gaslighted me my entire life. She was trying to use the fake psychiatric records they had forged to legally bury me. She thought if she screamed loud enough and cried hard enough, she could make everyone believe I was just a crazy woman having a public breakdown, and that the video was a fake. Outside the heavy walls of the Plaza Hotel, the wail of sirens began to pierce the rainy night. The sound started faint but quickly grew into a deafening chorus of approaching justice. The flashing red and blue lights of dozens of police cruisers reflected wildly against the high windows of the ballroom, painting the terrified faces of the crowd in harsh neon colors. Calvin frantically looked toward the back of the room, grabbing Gloria's arm and trying to pull her away from the stage toward the exit. But the heavy mahogany doors that had been locked shut were suddenly thrown open from the outside with tremendous force. A dozen FBI agents clad in dark tactical gear marched into the grand ballroom, their boots striking the floor with terrifying precision. They were flanked by local police officers who immediately moved to secure the perimeter of the room, blocking every possible exit. The wealthy crowd parted like the Red Sea, scrambling out of the way to avoid being caught in the crossfire of the federal raid. Vance stepped forward from the shadows near the entrance, his dark suit immaculate, his expression a mask of pure, cold satisfaction. He directed the heavily armed agents toward the front row with a single sharp nod. The lead FBI agent marched straight up to my father, grabbing him by the shoulder and throwing him roughly against the nearest banquet table. Calvin screamed out in pain as the agent kicked his legs apart and snapped cold steel handcuffs violently around his wrists, reading him his rights in a loud, booming voice. Gloria tried to run, but a female officer grabbed her by the collar of her expensive couture dress, dragging her backward and forcing her to the ground. The pearl necklace Gloria wore snapped under the force, scattering white beads across the hardwood floor like tiny bones as she was cuffed and pressed into the carpet. Two more agents bounded up the stage steps, grabbing Preston by his arms and hoisting him out of his own vomit. They slammed him against the podium he had intended to use to launch his political empire, clicking the cuffs tightly around his wrists while reciting the Miranda warning. The press corps was in an absolute frenzy, pushing against the police barricades. The camera flashes were blinding, a continuous strobe light of media documentation. They filmed every single second of the arrests, capturing the arrogant, powerful family being dragged away in chains. They filmed Chantel being lifted off the floor by paramedics, her mind so broken she did not even blink as they strapped her to a stretcher. I stood at the center of the stage watching the destruction I had orchestrated unfold in perfect, flawless harmony. I felt a deep, profound sense of peace settle into my bones. The ghost of Tara Pierce was finally laid to rest, replaced by a woman who would never be a victim again. I looked down at my mother, who was struggling against the officers holding her on the floor. She was still trying to yell, still trying to claim I was crazy and needed to be locked away. I slowly stepped down from the stage, my emerald heels making a soft, confident sound as I walked across the floor. The FBI agents paused for a moment, holding my parents on their knees as I approached. Calvin was weeping openly, tears streaming down his wrinkled face, begging me to tell the agents it was all a misunderstanding. Gloria looked up at me. Her makeup ruined her perfect life, utterly obliterated. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to offer one final manipulative lie, but I did not give her the chance. I looked down at the two people who had brought me into this world, only to try and tear me out of it. I looked at their chained hands and their broken spirits. I tilted my head slightly, a small, genuine smile touching my lips. I let out a low, dark chuckle that rolled over the noise of the room. I paused, letting the reality of their destruction wash over them completely. I looked deep into Gloria's terrified, panicked eyes. "I told you I was going to build my own empire," I said, my voice soft but carrying clearly over the chaos of the room. "You just did not realize my empire had 4K surround sound." The silence that followed my words was heavy enough to crush bone. The FBI agents did not hesitate for another second. They hauled Gloria up from the floor by the arms of her ruined designer gown, the cold steel of the handcuffs biting into her wrists. Calvin was already weeping openly, a pathetic, broken man being dragged away in his soaked custom suit. Chantel was completely unresponsive, her eyes vacant as paramedics strapped her to a gurney flanked by armed guards. The blinding flashes of the press cameras illuminated their disgrace, burning their shattered reputations into the public record forever. "Tara, please," Gloria begged, her voice cracking into a desperate, pathetic shriek as an agent shoved her toward the ballroom doors. "We are your family. We are your blood. You cannot do this to your own mother." I stood perfectly still on the stage, looking down at the woman who had traded my life for a beachfront vacation home. My expression did not change. "My mother died the night she poisoned my tea," I said, my voice carrying a quiet, absolute finality that silenced her sobs. "You are just a criminal trespassing in my venue." Gloria let out a hollow, devastated wail as the agents dragged her out into the rainy night. The reporters swarmed like vultures, capturing every second of her humiliating exit. Preston was next. He fought against the agents, his expensive shoes slipping on his own vomit as they hauled him upright. The lead federal agent read him his rights, reciting the charges of campaign fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit capital murder. Preston tried to scream his innocence to the wealthy donors who were already backing away in disgust, but his political career was turning to ashes right in front of his eyes. His entire, carefully manufactured life was gone. The very next morning, his powerful, wealthy family would issue a cold public statement, completely disowning him, cutting off his access to their vast fortune to save their own pristine reputation. He would face the federal prosecutors completely alone, without a single dime to pay for his high-powered defense attorneys. As the ballroom began to clear out under the strict direction of the police, my heart started beating frantically against my ribs for an entirely different reason. The heavy wooden doors near the back of the room swung open one last time. Vance stepped through the threshold, his dark suit immaculate, his presence radiating calm authority. But I barely even looked at him. My eyes were locked entirely on the small figure standing securely by his side. It was Dion. He was wearing his little blue jacket, his eyes wide as he took in the massive ballroom and the flashing lights outside. The moment he saw me standing on the stage, he let go of Vance's hand. He did not even glance at Chantel as she was wheeled past him on the stretcher. He ran straight down the center aisle, his small footsteps echoing in the cavernous room. I dropped to my knees on the crimson carpet, ignoring the cameras and the police. Dion leaped into my arms with a force that nearly knocked me backward. I buried my face in his neck, breathing in the scent of him, wrapping my arms around him so tightly I thought I might never let go. My tears were real this time, hot and fast, washing away months of pure terror and heartbreak. I knew you were too tough for the woods, Mommy Dion whispered fiercely into my shoulder, his small hands gripping the fabric of my emerald suit. I kissed his forehead, rocking him back and forth on the floor of the ballroom. I promised you I would always come back, I whispered against his hair. The nightmare was finally over. I had my son, and the monsters who had tried to take him were locked away in cages where they belonged. 1 year later, the air in the Blackwood Reserve was crisp and thick with the scent of fresh pine and damp earth. The morning sunlight filtered through the dense canopy of the ancient trees, casting warm golden shadows across the newly paved hiking trails. I walked hand in hand with Dion, listening to him chatter excitedly about the different types of bird calls he had learned to identify. I was not just a survivor hiding in a bunker anymore. I was a multimillionaire and the sole owner of a thriving luxury eco-resort nestled right in the heart of the mountains that my family had once tried to use as my graveyard. We reached a scenic overlook that provided a breathtaking view of the valley below. I sat down on a beautifully carved wooden bench, pulling a sleek tablet from my bag to check the morning briefing from Vance, who was now the chief operating officer of my entire enterprise. After reviewing the stellar quarterly profit reports, I swiped over to the local news feed. The headlines brought a familiar, cold satisfaction to my chest. Calvin and Gloria had been sentenced just days prior. The federal judge had shown absolutely no mercy, handing them both 25 years without the possibility of parole. The article detailed how Calvin had aged decades in the span of 12 months, his wealth stripped away to pay the massive legal fines. Gloria was languishing in a maximum security facility, stripped of her silk scarves and her country club status, forced to wear rough orange cotton and eat terrible cafeteria food. Preston was rotting in federal prison, awaiting a secondary trial for his financial crimes, completely abandoned by everyone who had ever known him. And then there was Chantel. Another article featured a grainy photograph leaked from the state penitentiary. It showed my beautiful, perfect sister, stripped of her heavy medication and her glamorous gowns. She was on her hands and knees wearing a drab gray uniform, scrubbing the grimy linoleum floors of the prison visitation room. Her hair was dull and lifeless, her face drawn and hollow. She was finally experiencing the exact life she had always thought she was too good for. She was living out the rest of her days at the very bottom of the food chain, completely erased from the elite society she had worshipped. I closed the tablet, sliding it back into my bag as a gentle breeze swept through the valley. The darkness of the past year felt like a distant nightmare fading away under the bright mountain sun. Dion climbed onto the bench beside me, swinging his legs and looking out over the endless expanse of green trees. "It is so pretty out here," Mommy Dion said, leaning his head against my arm. "It feels like everything is brand new." I wrapped my arm around his shoulders, pulling him close as I looked out over the thriving kingdom I had built from the ashes of my own destruction. I felt an incredible, profound peace settling deep into my soul. The mountain had not broken me. It had forged me into something entirely unbreakable. Sometimes I told my son, my voice soft but carrying the unyielding strength of a woman who had conquered her own grave. "You have to let the dead wood rot so the forest can breathe." The most profound lesson these stories teach is that true family is defined by actions, not just biology. Blood ties do not give anyone the right to diminish your worth, manipulate your future, or exploit your trust. True security comes from within, through building your own independence, trusting your instincts, and recognizing your inherent value. When toxic people try to tear you down, the ultimate revenge is not retaliation, but rather outgrowing their control. You must have the courage to set firm boundaries, walk away from environments that demand your shrinkage, and create a chosen family that genuinely celebrates your authentic self. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to find your own peace, share your story in the comments below and subscribe for more empowering journeys.